Engler served for 3 terms as governor of Michigan, a Midwest industrial state, not often led by Republicans. And when he was through with that, he came down here to Washington and was elected the president of the National Association of Manufacturers, which, as all of you know, is a huge industry group. Its members employing more than 14 million Americans in the vital jobs of producing America's goods. While he was governor, his trademark was tax cuts, and he enjoyed a very successful gubernatorial trio of terms. He is educated in Michigan, holds a law degree as well as a basic degree, and he is looking forward to addressing this group, and we are delighted to have him with us, Governor John Engler. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Chairman Frenzel. Chairman Frenzel and I are both probably about to share the same fate as the transition begins. We'll probably be relieved of our duties as he's the chairman of the ACPIN, the Advisory Committee on Trade Policy Negotiations. I'm the vice chairman. I'm not sure we'll be kept on, Mr. Chairman, but that burden will be lifted from us. But thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for literally a lifetime of public service and for the work that you're now doing with the New America Foundation and to the foundation itself. Thanks for organizing this event. It's as you know, the timing couldn't be better. Congress returns next week, and what I want to do today is take a few moments to talk about manufacturing, make the case for manufacturing, and why it's so critical in terms of the U.S. economy, talk a little bit about a stimulus package, perhaps. You've all seen the headlines. They tell the story pretty concisely, pretty in a almost dramatic, draconian fashion almost. Manufacturing in America is hurting today. The economy is shrinking. The GDP dropped, officially reported at 0.3. Estimates are, when it's revised, be down as much as 0.8 in the third quarter. That was the largest quarterly decline in some 7 years. Larry Lindsey was out last week with some numbers suggesting that according to his data, you could be looking at a fourth quarter GDP negative as much as 2.2%. Then you start washing that through the formulas, and he looks at it and says, look, it's an 80-20 sort of scenario, 80% now that the more negative estimates will hold, and that would then see unemployment some point in mid-09 hitting as high as 7.8, on its way to an eventual 10.5% unemployment rate. A depression that could be, as he says, again, 80-20, maybe long and deep, continuing on, maybe not at such a rapid rate, but on into 2010. The Institute of Supply Management wouldn't argue probably very much with that. The manufacturing index out recently, the lowest level in 26 years. There were 90,000 jobs lost in manufacturing last month. The heaviest hits were felt in areas like fabricated metal products, furniture, plastic, motor vehicles. I think housing probably isn't on that list so much because it's been so low for so long. Hours worked peaked way back in June, and since then have continued to slip. The auto industry in particular is in the news this morning, last week, tomorrow, and probably for some time to come. But the earnings reports last week, if you missed them, and it was hard to miss them, Ford lost $3 billion in the last quarter. General Motors lost $2.5 billion. More ominous, sales of cars, light trucks dropped 45% in October, the worst sales month since the end of World War II. Now, we had 3 years where the former governor of Michigan used to kind of watch these numbers. Vehicle sales were over 17 million vehicles, dropped off a little bit this year, quite a bit down. Next year's numbers, You get a wide array of estimates. Some are in the 12.5 million vehicle range. You've got some that think it's between 10 and 11 million vehicles. That's pretty scary, and that's pretty big impact. The financial impact's being felt in a lot of places. You can, in Chicago today, the president-elect is on his way here. The news reported this will be his first steps ever into the Oval Office at 2 o'clock this afternoon when he meets the president. Pretty impressive campaign, but you wouldn't blame him if it might be more tempting to go shopping for that puppy instead of looking at some of these economic numbers. Boy, oh boy. I do think that the president-elect and his incoming chief of staff made it pretty clear over the weekend and the press conference on Friday. There's a pretty keen understanding of how bad some of these numbers are and what serious economic challenges are facing the nation. I think one thing that I chalk up as a very smart move was to go ahead and signal to the Congress that, look, it's good to proceed now, and a president-elect could have easily said, well, why don't we just wait and we'll do this when I get there. Instead, they're going to do some things early, and there's no question it's going to be front and center come January 21. I think that's a smart approach. Now, one of the challenges we have, and I came in just on the tail end of the other panel, but I know Bill Hoagland's up next, so I suspect that I can consider myself bracketed in this regard, that you start trying to do a pre-holiday, post-election bill, whether you call it a stimulus, economic rescue, or whatever wrappings you want to put around it, however pretty the paper and the ribbon might be, it could well contain lots of Christmas presents. That is the challenge, I think, for those of us who look at part of this as being absolutely necessary and potentially quite helpful. What's the cost to get it done? What happens along the way? Now, I've got a real simple rule. I used to use this back in Michigan, but I thought it was pretty good advice to legislators that I was working with, and I think it works even at the federal level, even though I recognize Washington is very, very different. But if you're going to pack a package, you're designing it to help people, then do no harm. Let's start there. Do no harm first. So I would say don't raise taxes, don't increase regulations, don't add taxes to energy production, and let's focus on those areas that are absolutely the highest priority, and let's try to have a rationale and a plan for what we're up to. I do think the auto industry is on that list, and I understand just watching the commentary, an excellent article by Paul Ingratius today in the Wall Street Journal on this very topic, but one of the challenges we've got if we're talking about economic recovery in America is what do you do with an automotive sector that's the nation's largest manufacturing sector? Estimates are that it's as much as 20% of our manufacturing GDP. You let that industry go down, you've got some 4,200 plus pretty key suppliers that are out there, and then you've got a whole lot of ancillary employment from retailers, in other words, the dealers, and we've had dozens of dealerships have closed this year. Transportation sector gets impacted, and so much, much more. On the supplier side, and I do think that's where the focus needs to be. The auto industry itself is the most integrated manufacturing sector we've got. We've talked about the virtues of that in the past, but it is far and away, it's not even close. They've been this way for some time. But look at the supplier side. Harvard Meritor just announced the elimination of additional 1,250 jobs, about 7% of their global workforce. Federal-Mogul is out with an announcement, shut down several new factories. Dana last week, 2,000 jobs being eliminated, some 10 plants that they're closing. That's on top of 3,000 jobs that were announced earlier. And the list goes on. The Center for Automotive Research looked at a study of economic effects of shutting down the Detroit auto companies, and they said, what would it be if we went out completely? What would it be if there was a 50% reduction? A 50% reduction would reduce personal income by more than $125 billion in the first year, a total loss of $275 billion over 3 years. Total tax revenues to state and federal governments dropped more than $108 billion over 3 years. That's about what, well, some estimates are pretty high on what those local government and state government deficits are right now, but that had $108 billion. We think that the far-reaching consequences of what happens in this sector warrant additional federal role. So that's where the National Association of Manufacturers comes from. We don't do this lightly, but when we look at this and the impact, and we're well aware of the questions, if you start, where do you stop? All tough questions, but boy, when you're talking about an economy which is so impacted by that one sector, and the terms and conditions are to be negotiated. There's no question about that, and I think that's to be expected. The low-interest loans, the $25 billion that were approved or funded back in October, were first authorized back in 2005. Now, at the time, that was all for environmental compliance when there was basically a 40% hike in mileage that was being mandated, and so they were going to help all this retooling. DOE is at work trying to make those funds available, but there's a lot of sense that isn't going to be anytime soon. But today we're at a point where if you look at the cash burn, Ford said they went through some $7.7 billion during the third quarter, General Motors through $6.9 billion. General Motors said they wouldn't have enough money to operate, early next year. Pretty compelling case. When I mentioned the integration, what you've got then is that these suppliers aren't just General Motors or Ford suppliers any longer. They're Honda suppliers and Toyota suppliers, so you get a system-wide collapse. So these are extraordinary times, never before having been seen. The choices are not easy for the Congress, for the next administration, but these are extraordinary times, and they are going to demand extraordinary actions. So I want to talk a little bit about infrastructure, which is really why I wanted to be here and was excited about the opportunity, because I do think that the funding of infrastructure is another idea whose time has finally come. And now, from a manufacturing standpoint, yes, we make a lot of equipment that is used to build infrastructure, but more importantly, quality of infrastructure is a competitive advantage or disadvantage depending on the condition. And we've underinvested for so long that in many areas of the country it's a disadvantage today. Congestion is an expensive proposition. I've got a couple of statistics I'll try to make that point with, but we think that funding infrastructure is critical to the manufacturing economy, and yes, we still think we've got one. I should have made that point earlier, perhaps, but we are the largest manufacturing economy in the world. A lot of gloom and doom surrounding it, but number two, Japan, isn't all that close, and China's actually down in the third spot. We're probably last year passing, or actually 2008 this year, passing Germany as the world's largest exporter. So, in fact, exports have been so robust that exports in the past year have largely added back to GDP what the housing collapse has taken away, and that statistic usually shocks people. It's one of the reasons, and people have been commenting about Rahm Emanuel's selection. The one thing that he has been is a strong supporter of NAFTA, of all the trade deals, so he's been good on those issues, and I think one of the things that needs to be kept in focus during, again, tough economic times is don't do like was done in the 30s and compound the problem on the tariff side. I mean, let's keep the doors open and let's be aggressive on trade. But for infrastructure, I testified in front of Chairman Oberstar and his committee the week before the election, and we talked a lot about the fact there's roughly $18 billion worth of projects that are in the ready-to-go category. In other words, they've been designed, they've been approved, the environmental permits are, however onerous that may have been, they've gotten them, they're ready to go. These could start now. Given the decline in some of the commodity prices also, you can actually get infrastructure built at a little bit of a bargain now. The steel prices have come down, the concrete, cement's going to be a little cheaper, asphalt going to be a little cheaper, so with oil prices coming down. So you've got a lot of things that would argue that this is a pretty good investment, and we think at least with this, you can say a lot about different aspects of the stimulus package, but if you fix the bridge, you rebuild the road, you build the transit, you'll be able to use it for about 50 years, given what we've been doing with the current infrastructure. investment. We'll have something when we're done. And I think the economic impact of that in terms of the commerce that depends on infrastructure can be very positive. And it isn't just about highways and bridges either. I would suggest that we need to look more broadly. Inland waterways, they move major energy and agriculture commodities for not only domestic use, but also for the export markets. There's $1 billion to $1.5 billion federal investment there that would take 16 projects, again, that would be lock and dam type projects that are on the pretty much ready to go list, so we can get those underway. The aviation sector, everybody in this room flies. Some of you fly more than you wish. We need to get some of those projects built, but in particular, we ought to fast track our nation's transition to a satellite-based air traffic control system. This is part of the argument I make when I get into the capital budget outlay debate, because I think we need a capital budget in the federal government, and you'd certainly, any sensible person would bomb the whole air traffic control system and just get it built. We don't need to wait, as is suggested over at DOT, some 20 years to roll this out. Building that now gets us safer skies, reduces congestion, improves the reliability, and actually reduces, as the airline industry will argue, the carbon footprint of the industry by reducing those miles and making it more efficient. So that's a bit of a down payment that if we took some of those projects on in the infrastructure area, that would, I think, be both helpful to the broader economy and beneficial to U.S. competitiveness. No, those are, I think, win-win propositions, and they're sort of they sort of work for everyone, regardless of their party affiliation, regardless of sort of whatever interest they might have. I mean, those are there, and we think in the manufacturing economy that we need a 25-year plan for infrastructure, a long-term strategy to rebuild competitiveness that's well beyond patches. And I'm not suggesting that these projects that are ready to go are the highest priority. They are ready to go. We have others that in some cases have been delayed years because there's no funding available or because permits are hard to get. I'd fast track the environmental permits and set up a national priority on some of these. UPS says every 5-minute delay in its drivers' deliveries due to traffic congestion costs the company $100 million a year. General Mills spends $650 million a year trucking hundreds of millions of cases, obviously, to market. Every single mile per hour, 1 mile per hour reduction in the average speed of deliveries adds $2 million to company costs. You pay for that. I mean, and that's what we ought to get on top of. In China, they've just announced another dramatic infrastructure expenditure they're preparing to make. During the Olympics, we saw firsthand some of the progress they'd been making, but it's not just China. The premier down in Australia, same thing. They're stepping forward into getting some of these projects done. A number of countries around the world. We used to spend routinely, I think from 50s to the 70s, more than 3% of our GDP on infrastructure. We're now significantly below that and have been for some time. So we're living off Grandpa's investment in the infrastructure. It's now time for us to step up for the next generation. Now, I don't think government's the sole actor in this. I don't want to give that impression. Part of this ought to be also to pave the way for the public-private partnerships that I think are helpful. I think that they ought to be welcomed and really encouraged, and some of those barriers in this economic climate ought to be removed, again, to accelerate the pace of investment. And we think actually some of this is actually, like the air traffic control system, the kind of debt that has a wonderful revenue source right attached to it, and so it really does work very, very well. We think, just to close on this final point, I guess, I don't have time today to talk about taxes, although I'd love to get into some of this, but I think the private investment and the private sector play a big role in economic recovery, not just with infrastructure, and there's no way the federal government can do this all by itself. And so, while assistance was needed to help financial institutions and companies get through some of this credit, and we're still working our way through that. It's interesting, every time an action is taken, it has a consequence somewhere else. The government guarantees commercial credit Tier 1, then everybody wants to buy Tier 1 commercial credit, but not Tier 2. And a lot of our companies who need it the most are in that tier, and so suddenly their markets dry up. But as we work through this, it seems to me that we ought to keep in mind that rule about doing no harm, and we ought to be looking at, as we make decisions, what's the impact on our nation's competitiveness? Because the one thing that's different in 2008 than in any period previously in history, I think, at least in the more modern post-World War II era of economic times, is that our competition's never been better, never been tougher, able to move faster than they are today. And so we don't have time in many of these areas to recover if we do something that puts us significantly at disadvantage. You can give up a market, you can give up a lot of opportunity, and you can do it very quickly. We used to, I think, have an abiding faith in America's engineers and scientists. Oh, don't worry, pass the rules, pass the regulations, they'll figure it out. But at what cost? And I'm arguing today that we don't have that margin. That's not there any longer. We don't have the luxury of saying, well, in 5 years we'll figure this out, and if it's a few billions of dollars, so what? Because the mobility of goods and services around the world, including the fact that so many of the larger American corporations are finding most of their growth taking place in other parts of the world, in some cases growth that's export driven. In other words, they're building it here and shipping it there. Down the road, where does the next investment get made? It doesn't have to be here. And so we better be thinking in terms of our attractiveness and the impact on our competitiveness. And so when you start getting careless about tax rates or eliminating secret ballots and just simply saying unions can exist wherever union bosses want to have them, and the workers have no say in that, those kinds of things and more issues like that can all come into play. So when you get at the tax code, same thing. A lot of people in Congress say, well, yeah, our corporate tax rate is the second highest. They'll acknowledge that. It's an irrefutable fact. The OECD does the rankings. You say, well, don't worry about that high tax rate. There's all these other adjustments that get made. Therefore, it's really very, very low. The problem is when people run the numbers, and some of these companies that run those numbers are members of the National Association of Manufacturers, and they tell me, look, it's a huge disadvantage. Plus, we didn't fix immigration, so I can't get the talent here easily, and I need the best talent in the world in the space that I'm in. Plus, I've got foreign earnings out there, and if I bring those back, I've got to subject those to that high tax rate. Remember when we lowered the tax rate on repatriation, about $300 billion came back very quickly. We sort of punish you for bringing your money back. So if the policy is keep your money offshore, cheaper rate, if you're offshore, you can get anybody to work for you. Anywhere in the world, they can get to you. Your corporate tax rate's less. Oh, and by the way, we've even got a better R&D tax credit, and guess what? It's permanent. I mean, what kind of a signal are we sending? So we better be focused on competitiveness. Time's real short. I'd love to get into the tax issues later on, Mr. Chairman, but I think for the New America Foundation, I put a few things on the table I hope that stimulate or provoke some discussion and commentary later on as you go through this day. But I want to, again, close by commending you for gathering us together. We can't do too much talking about how we get out of this problem. The problem is that big. It needs all of us. Thank you very much. Yeah.
The governor has agreed to take a few questions if you'd care to place.
Yes, sir.
I have a question for you. Generally, the politicians come out. Of course, we've had a. Generally, the politicians come out. We've had a fairly severe 8 years of defense spending. Of course, the wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere. We see the resurgence, for instance, of the Soviets with some of more armaments, also the Chinese. Now, invariably, when the politicians are told by the economists do something, politicians will often say no or just largely ignore it. Now, your state of Michigan has very much been impacted, as you've explained, with what's happened with Detroit. Is it time that we have some proactive type policies, many people would say they'd be progressive, or is this going to be another boondoggle down the road? How would you, in the next 5 days, you have this G20 economic summit coming here to Washington. Will they impose what both Europe and Asia want to do against the United States? And that's largely my question.
Well, a lot of questions, a lot of sort of commentary in there, I guess. But I do think it is time to have, first of all, the economic meeting is going to be here. The one overriding obligation clearly is to have a world financial system that works. I mean, so that we have capital flows that work, so that we can have appropriate liquidity. We still have, I think, though, when you get beyond that, the need to make a very sort of hard-eyed appraisal of where we are, where do we have deficits. I happen to think we've got a big infrastructure deficit in this country. I think we've also got, interestingly enough, a skills gap, which is something I hope I saw one of the reports that said even General Paul might like to take Education Secretary's role. For what we spend on education in America, nearly $550 billion a year, there is no excuse whatsoever for us to have a skills gap there, either in terms of what, the ability of our kids coming out of school would be, or their preparedness to go into the workforce, and yet that's massive. That would save alone billions of dollars in training that companies are having to do because the kids are arriving without the skills. It would save billions in the universities where they're doing remedial education that they shouldn't be doing to get kids up to the level of doing their college work. So, I mean, that one's on us. Nobody in the world has put that problem on our shoulders. That's ours to fix. I think when we look at infrastructure, again, policy choice here. I think on the military front, it's going to be an interesting conversation, and maybe one that the President-elect will be wanting to have relative to, how much of the burden have we shouldered. What you left out in the last 8 years is, of course, one big rip-roaring attack on our own soil, and the impact and the reality of global terrorism too. So, but is anybody else stepping up to help with that, and how will that be done in terms of the fight for democracy and freedom in the world? I think all of this stuff is part of the conversation of a new president, and there's a new opportunity, if you will. But there are, at the same time, we fret about things globally, and one of the things I'd like to see the G20 group do, that would be a real positive thing. Every one of the leaders from these nations has talked about the environment. China today was in the paper saying, well, of course the developed world should pay for our technology. Well, the first thing they could do, the G20 could drop all the tariffs and all the burdens on trade, on those products which are designed to prevent pollution or clean up pollution. Let's have that be, just like software in the world, a completely worldwide tariff-free, duty-free trade in environmental and energy efficient and pollution prevention goods and services. That would be a huge positive thing. I mean, we shouldn't be having something that's energy efficient being subjected to a 20% tariff at somebody's border. I mean, that's an example. So that's something only the world could do, but the people sitting in that room actually could make a sectoral agreement in that area, and we wouldn't have to wait for Doha. We wouldn't have to wait for anything. That could be done. Your question is complex. I mean, it is the essence of governing in all of its aspects, and that's the best I can do to comment on it, I guess. You want me to pick them, or Bill, do you want me pick them? Oh, great. I'll start here, I'll go down there, and then over there. There's three.
Hi, Robert Schroeder with International Investor. For 30 years, some of us have been following this industry, and we've watched time after time when there was calls for mileage per gallon standards to be raised, et cetera. Guys like you came to Washington and said, no, we shouldn't be putting any of these requirements onto Detroit. You started off your speech now saying do no harm, no new taxes, no energy taxes, no new regulations. But I heard very little about whether there should be a new bailout. So yes, I can see coming to the taxpayers and saying, well, we can up from the $25 billion to $50 billion if necessary to save this very important industry. We understand the importance of it. but not to do business as usual. Only if we make it as an investment as American taxpayers, so that Detroit is forced to come out on the other end as a leader, as a world leader in terms of developing energy efficient cars that are right for the 21st century.
Well, I think that's great. All we have to do is get you to buy them then. I mean, if we were to back up a little bit, I mean, I think you could argue, you could make an argument that we would have been better off, you know, sort of absent other than safety regulation, let the market work and let them compete on whatever models and makes they want to sell with whatever gas mileage they want to bring to market. You see, today in Texas, there was a report I heard, you know, gas prices have dropped a little bit, so what's happening? They're working overtime in the Texas plant where they're building the large utility trucks down there. So they're back, you know, consumers are speaking again. We have been, one of the problems we also have today, which I think is very much at the heart of this Waxman challenge to John Dingell, if you read, you actually don't have to read between the lines, it's in the article. He wants to protect and preserve the right of California to be the auto regulator. He wants to have a California regulation policy, and then other governors and other states will think they should have that. You've got the EU, 27 nations coming together to have a single set of regulations. We got 50 states that can't even work together. So all that stuff has a lot of cost. I do not stand here and be an apologist for the auto industry. There are plenty of mistakes, and I was a governor of a state where the high costs of the UAW contracts with the Detroit 3 rippled through the entire state, were a problem in state government. As a governor, I negotiated with the largest UAW local, the welfare workers in Michigan. All those social workers are in the UAW. So I'm somewhat familiar and not willing to give a blanket defense about all of these decisions. And these problems also, again, this was pointed out in the Journal article today, these are not overnight problems. They've been building for a long time. I was governor 12 years. Not a single day did General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler want to be bigger while I was governor. They pushed a lot of work out to those suppliers. And in fact, the biggest argument for looking at that industry today is the supplier base, which can take down not just the Detroit companies, but now everybody else as those suppliers go. And you say, well, it's just some disruption. We'll sort this out. But in some ways, the easiest people, the most ready to fill those gaps might not be here in this country. So that's what your worry should be. That's what mine is. Yeah.
I'm Jed Schilling with the Millennium Institute, and partly to follow up on the previous question, where Detroit very actively pursued the SUVs and other cars and did not develop the technology for cars that were low gas consumers, so that Americans shifted overseas to other suppliers. So we've had this demonstration in the industry. You are now suggesting that the government, which is to say the people of the United States, should come in and bail out the industry, which is facing major failure. And I don't deny that we need to save the industry, but I want to ask you, what does the industry then owe the American people for having provided unlimited insurance to their survival after they've made so many bad decisions? The foreign automobile companies are not about to collapse because of this, because they have a better mix of cars.
Well, first of all, I don't think any assistance can be unlimited, and I think that's, I mean, that's if it goes that way, I don't think there'll be, you know, if that's what the ask is, I don't think that's even successful, even in maybe President Obama's administration. I don't see them being willing to go there either. What is the obligation? You know, I think I've heard some feedback today. I've had some calls. I mean, in the manufacturing community, there's also very mixed thoughts about all of this, much like some of the questions are reflecting here. But it's interesting. There's also this question: what's Ron Gettelfinger doing with the companies? Isn't that a big part of the problem? And yet, in these meetings, they're sitting side by side, because it's pretty clear that you do have an overcapacity in North America. You certainly got overcapacity if you're only selling 12 million vehicles. a lot of overcapacity at that point. But where I do think there's an issue, and it's a point I tried to get across on the integration, even today, the Toyotas and the Hondas are somewhat dependent on that supplier base because of the integration that's taken place. And they can't, there'll have to be considerable thought given to how any assistance is impactful there, because that's where you could get a national slowdown. The other thing I would say about, it's easy to blame the companies, but it's strange in China General Motors is number one, in Brazil General Motors is number one. In other words, they're hitting the market there with what consumers want, but are missing it back here at home. So just an interesting point. I mean, in other words, globally, when Delphi went into bankruptcy, they took the North American part of Delphi into bankruptcy, not the rest of the world where they're actually making money. So it's so there's a little disconnect from rhetorically what some of the advocates are for running the auto industry with, in fact, what they're and the fellowship of the consumers to buy what you want them to make. I mean, that's where we got to work on that. Is we got to be more successful getting the consumers to listen to you, powerful advocates for change in the industry.
Can you answer the question of what the automobile industry would owe the American public at whatever level of bailout support they get?
Well, I think they owe they owe the money back, and they owe a change in the way in which they've operated. That change has been underway, but we also owe some things along with this in terms of I think we've got to decide what are the regulations of this industry going to be, who's going to do the regulating. I favor in this area preemption and having it done with one regulator at the national level that everybody lives with. I don't think we ought to have the kind of regulation that encourages, say, some companies to use what they call foreign content in order to move around environmental and mileage requirements. There's a lot of games that get played because of the regulations that are in place. So it's a two-way street. I think if they come in for money, there's going to have to be a restructured industry. And how that goes, I'm not smart enough to be able to tell you that today. I've got a gentleman back there, then I've got the lady in the orange and the one in the white. I had him first.
And asking similar questions. But let me pose it a different way.
Sure.
You've talked a lot about infrastructure, lots of infrastructure projects ready to go. Couldn't be more agreeable. Infrastructure will be very important. But how do we make sure that the infrastructure that we're putting into place is not simply infrastructure that extends large highway networks as opposed to mass transit, less carbon intensive, less sprawl kinds of things in looking ahead 25 years. And it's linked as well to the automobile industry, which is obviously a powerhouse that could be producing railway cars that are high-speed railway trucks as much as they're producing cars. How do we get the automobile industry redirected toward much more carbon efficient kinds of products? And how do we ensure that the infrastructure we're building is infrastructure that will promote growth as opposed to simply extending the sort of very carbon-using kind of transport networks that we've been having? Well,
I have good news for industry writ large on that front. Our energy intensity has been dramatically reduced. Our energy efficiency has gone up sharply. We've virtually doubled the amount of output per BTU consumed in the last 20 or so years. It is far and away the most impressive record of success of any part of the American economy. If only homeowners could come to that level. And so part of the discussion is how does everybody get on the energy efficiency bandwagon? There's going to be more done, but the fleet today of vehicles at all levels actually it's a cleaner. I mean, the diesel truck regulations that will take effect now for 2010, we're sort of 2 steps through, and we've got new diesel engines coming in 2010, literally will function as air cleaners as they travel down the highway. The ambient air they take in will come out of that system cleaner than when it went in. I mean, that's the advance in technology. Part of this is trying to get it all so much of it at the tailpipe when there's so many other things. I mean, I think a third of all emissions come out of just the power generation itself. I mean, the utility industry. So in manufacturing, we care a lot about electricity because we use a third of it. So we're into this debate. I think that American industry, including the auto industry, has made great gains. They're not zero impact cars. They're not electric cars, but if you go to let's say tomorrow we woke up, we all had an electric vehicle in our garage. I don't know how much more electricity that would take, but 50% of the electricity in the country comes from coal-burning plants. So is that better for the environment or worse? I don't know. We could say the car is better, but the environment's worse. I mean, that's some of the balancing that has to be done. Bill, I've got the two women that are online here, and I cannot. I got to do the distaff side here. Yes, yes, this table and right over there for the next. I'll try to be very brief.
Again, I think most of what I want to say has been preempted. What I wanted to I remember I was in business school in '81. It was the first Chrysler bailout. At that time was said, the first Chrysler bailout was in 1981. And at that time...
$1.5 billion, by the way.
Yeah. And at that time was said, bad example, don't do that. This will be the one and only one. Just the background of my thinking. I also think that automobile companies in the US have been, if they're well managed, they didn't show. And they have not been innovative, they haven't taken opportunities. Right now, from what I heard you say, you're promoting business as usual. We just go on, we let the people choose if they want to have big trucks or not, screw the environment, things like that. This is an opportunity where this country could be an innovator up front, where technologies could be developed that, we can use, if we put money into solar, into other things, it really could work. But I don't hear anyone saying that. All I hear is, get those companies. You could create more jobs that way than you can by bailing out.
I don't believe even this Congress will mandate the abolition of SUVs and bigger vehicles. I do not believe they'll do it.
So they don't need to support it by,
Pardon?
They don't need to support by not requiring decent mileage.
Okay. All right. Last question over here.
I was wondering, in those countries that you mentioned where GM is the top car seller, or is that what you said? The top?
Yeah.
Brazil was one of them. Is there legislation, federal legislation in those countries which channel the demand of their consumers and perhaps limit nothing at all? How about competition?
There's lots of competition. I mean,
I believe Brazil has made use of other fuels for their cars.
Yes, their ethanol. I think Brazil is pretty much an ethanol-run fleet.
Even in GM cars?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is some modification.
And those cars are here. I mean, they're all over the streets. I mean, ethanol-run cars are here.
But Brazil must put more ethanol into their motors than here, I think.
Yeah, I think there, but I mean, if they put it in everybody's car, then I don't think that's the advantage, or the disadvantage isn't the fuel.
I'm just wondering what makes them number one in those countries.
Well,
and what those people are buying, what kind of cars?
Well, they're smaller vehicles, no question about it. They're designed for those markets, and
Are they available here?
Probably can't get approval to bring them in from our EPA and safety agencies. I don't know, but you can't bring the clean-burning diesel engines from Europe, which would be about a 30% fuel reduction, to this country, which we ought to immediately allow that to happen because of the fuel savings and the high-performance diesel engines. But the China cars are smaller. The China cars, I know, would not pass, I don't think, either safety nor environmental issues here. They're designed, they don't have all of the bells and whistles, let's say, that would be required in this market. They're not, I wouldn't think they're far off, but they wouldn't, I mean, we can't bring a European car here. Again, I would, as a matter of harmony, I'd recognize European standards if they'd recognize ours so we could switch the cars back and forth.
So this is just a political problem more than
No, but
production
I'm
problem.
just making the point that as troubled as the companies may be, as difficult as some of the decision-making may have been, there are markets today where they're succeeding. And I hope I had a little success in being with you today. Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks, Dan.